Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
It would soon come to be that anyone living in any American city would know exactly where these forgotten islands were, if only to make sure to avoid them. Under the viaduct along a polluted stream in Akron, Ohio, in the Hill District in Pittsburgh, Roxbury in Boston, the east side of Cincinnati, the near east side of Detroit, nearly all of East St. Louis, whole swaths of the south side of Chicago and south central in Los Angeles, and much of Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant in New York. Like other migrants with limited options, Ida Mae and her family moved from place to place, from one unacceptable flat to a slightly larger and less odious option a few blocks away, not unlike sharecroppers moving from farm to farm, looking for a less exploitive arrangement with, they hoped, a fairer planter. Soon they were living on the top floor of a 3-flat at 36th and Wabash. It was well into the Great Depression, and a man took to sleeping at odd hours of the day on the little landing outside their kitchen door. "I opened the door and put garbage out there, and he still be asleep," Ida Mae remembered. "I don't know who he was. He stayed there winter and summer. He didn't bother nobody. He was sleeping like he was in a bed. He had his little cover out there." "Did he ever wake up when you went out there?" I asked her once. "No," she said, "because I reckon he done did his devilment all night." Ida Mae didn't know it, but with the Great Depression deepening, she and her family had arrived in a city unprepared for and utterly resistant to the continuing influx of migrants. City fathers and labor experts had expected the Great Migration to end with World War I. Jobs and housing were scarcer now. White unions were refusing colored workers' membership, keeping colored wages low, restricting the work that migrants could do, and leaving them unprotected during cutbacks. The colored old-timers who were already there were not especially happy to see them. Even as the migration was a bonanza for colored storekeepers and businessmen, it meant more competition for the already limited kinds of jobs blacks were allotted, and made the black presence in the city more conspicuous and threatening to the city's racial alchemy. As it was, the city was still recovering from the tensions of one of the worst race riots in American history. The riots had set the city on edge and hardened race lines that would persist for generations. The trouble began after an incident only blocks from the 3-flat at 36th and Wabash, where Ida Mae's family would live exactly 2 decades later. It was the summer of 1919. World War I, the stimulus of the first wave of the Great Migration, was over. Munitions plants had shut down. The factories that lured black Southerners were now letting workers go. The country was on the verge of recession, not able even to imagine the actual depression that was brewing. The migrants, hemmed in and living on top of one another, even as more of them arrived, pressed against the white neighborhoods on their borders and were met with death threats and bombings when they ventured to the other side. The demilitarized zone was a moving target that no one could see, but that everyone knew in his bones. Blacks were finding more things off-limits than it would otherwise appear, defined by custom and whites' discomfort rather than by law. Even the beaches of Lake Michigan were segregated. Everyone was feeling the strain of a declining economy. Whites saw the migrants as competition for a scarcer pool of jobs and took to attacking them along the western boundary of the Black Belt. Then on Sunday, July 27, 1919, a 17-year-old black boy named Eugene Williams, swimming along the shore of Lake Michigan, drifted past an invisible line in the lake into the white side of the 29th Street beach. As was common in the North, There were no white or colored signs. It was merely understood that whites entered and used the beach at 29th Street, and blacks were to stay near the 27th Street entrance, 2 blocks north. The imaginary color line stretched out into the water. Swimming as he was, the boy couldn't see the line where the white water began, because the water looked the same. Carl Sandburg, the future poet who was then a reporter for the Chicago Daily News, recounted it this way. A colored boy swam across an imaginary segregation line. White boys threw rocks at him and knocked him off a raft. He was drowned. Blacks demanded that the white police officer on the scene arrest the whites they said had hurled rocks at Williams. The officer refused, arresting instead a black man in the crowd on a white man's complaint. Within hours, tensions reached a boil on both sides, and a riot was in full cry. Whites dragged black passengers from streetcars and beat them. Blacks stabbed a white peddler and a white laundryman to death. 2 white men were killed walking through a black neighborhood, and 2 black men were killed walking through a white neighborhood. White gangs stormed the Black Belt, setting houses on fire, hunting down black residents, firing shotguns, and hurling bricks. All told, the riots coursed through the south and southwest sides of the city for 13 days, killing 38 people, 23 blacks and 15 whites, and injuring 537 others, 342 blacks, 178 whites, the rest unrecorded, and not ending until a state militia subdued them. Contrary to modern-day assumptions, for much of the history of the United States, from the draft riots of the 1860s to the violence over desegregation a century later, riots were often carried out by disaffected whites against groups perceived as threats to their survival. Thus, riots would become to the north what lynchings were to the south, each a display of uncontained rage by put-upon people directed toward the scapegoats of their condition. Nearly every big northern city experienced one or more during the 20th century. Each outbreak pitted 2 groups that had more in common with each other than either of them realized. Both sides were made up of rural and small-town people who had traveled far in search of the American dream, both relegated to the worst jobs by industrialists who pitted one group against the other. Each side was struggling to raise its families in a cold, fast, alien place far from their homelands, and looked down upon by the earlier, more sophisticated arrivals. They were essentially the same people except for the color of their skin, and many of them arrived into these anonymous receiving stations at around the same time, one set against the other, and unable to see the commonality of their mutual plight. Thus these violent clashes bore the futility of Greek tragedy. Yet the situation was even more complicated than the black migrants could have imagined. As they made their way north, so did some of the poorer whites from the South, looking not for freedom from persecution, but for greater economic rewards for their hard work. Slavery and sharecropping, along with the ravages of the boll weevil and floods, had depressed the wages of every worker in the South. The call of the North drew some of the Southern whites the migrants had sought to escape.
Initially, they came to the North in greater numbers, but they were much more likely to return south than colored Southerners were. Fewer than half of all white Southerners who left actually stayed in the North for good, thus behaving more like classic migrant workers than immigrants. Still, many brought their prejudices with them and melted into the white, working-class world of ethnic immigrants to make a potent advance guard against black inroads in the North. As a window into their sentiments, a witness to the Detroit riots in 1943 gave this description of a white mob that had attacked colored people in that outbreak. By the conversation of the men gathered there, I was able to detect that they were Southerners and that they resented Negroes working beside them and receiving the same amount of money, the informant said, adding that these Southern whites believed that the black migrants ought to be taken down a peg or two.
perhaps the earliest indication of what the migrants were unknowingly up against, came from an outbreak directly related to the Great Migration, or rather to how the North reacted to the newcomers from the South. These were the riots that erupted in East St. Louis, Illinois, in the summer of 1917, after companies being struck by white workers hired colored migrants to replace them. The migrants were flocking to the city at a rate of 1,000 a month, some 18,000 having arrived that spring, and they instantly became the perfect pawns, an industrialist's dream. They were desperate to leave the South, anxious for work, untutored in union politics or workers' rights, as most could not have imagined unionizing themselves as field hands, thus uncomprehending of the idea of a worker making demands, and unlikely to complain about whatever conditions they might face. Once the strike was over, the colored migrants, resented by the unions and unprotected by the plants that had hired them, paid the price. One union wrote its members that the immigration of the Southern Negro into our city for the past 8 months has reached a point where drastic action must be taken, and demanded that the city retard this growing menace and devise a way to get rid of a certain portion of those who are already here. On the night of July 1st, a carload of whites fired shots into colored homes. The colored residents fired back when a second car filled with whites passed through, killing 2 policemen. The next day, full-scale rioting began. Colored men were stabbed, clubbed, and hanged from telephone poles. A colored 2-year-old was shot and thrown into the doorway of a burning building. A black skin was a death warrant on the streets of this Illinois city, wrote an observer shortly afterward. The police, charged with quelling the riot, in some cases joined in, as did some in the state militia sent in to restore order, actions that resulted in 7 courts-martial. All told, 39 blacks and 8 whites were killed, more than 100 blacks were shot or maimed, and 5,000 blacks were driven from their homes. After the 2 riots, city leaders in Chicago could see no end to the racial divisions without intervention and a public appeal for tolerance. A white-led biracial commission set up to investigate the climate and circumstances leading to the riots produced a 672-page report, The Negro in Chicago. It stands to this day as one of the most comprehensive examinations of both the early stages of the Great Migration and race relations in a northern American city. With a sense of urgency, it set out 59 recommendations for improving race relations. It urged that the police rid the city's colored section of the vice and prostitution that plagued the Black Belt, that the schools hire principals with an interest in promoting good race relations, that white citizens seek accurate information about blacks as a basis of their judgments, that restaurants, stores, and theaters stop segregating when they weren't supposed to, that companies deal with Negroes as workmen on the same plane as white workers and stop using them as strikebreakers and denying them apprenticeships, that labor unions admit colored workers when they qualified, that employers permit Negroes an equal chance with whites to enter all positions for which they are qualified by efficiency and merit, that the press avoid using epithets in referring to blacks and treat black stories and white stories with the same standards and sense of proportion. With the Commission having no authority to enforce its recommendations, and a good portion of the citizenry not likely even to have seen them, much of its counsel went unheeded. So Ida May arrived in a world that was perhaps even tenser than before the riots. In the ensuing decades, the color line would only stiffen. The South Side would become almost totally black, and the North Side almost totally white. Ida May's adopted home would become one of the most racially divided of all American cities, and remain so for the rest of the 20th century. New York, summer 1945, George Swanson Starling. George finally brought Inez to New York in June of 1945 to begin life on their own for the first time in their marriage. Now that he had a decent job on the railroad, he was hoping she could now get a job as a beautician like she had trained for, and they could make a go of it in New York. But Inez was still nursing a grudge over how little time they had spent together since they had been married, how he'd gone off to Detroit without her, how he had taken so long to send for her, and now, here he was, likely to be gone half the time working the rails. He was always the one with big dreams, and he had them now. He wanted to make up for all they didn't have and couldn't have back in Florida. He located a little beauty shop around the corner from the brownstone where they lived that had 6 available booths for her to use. "Inez, this is your chance," he told her. "We can rent this place, and you can do hair in one booth and rent out the other 5 booths. You can build you up a business here, and then after a while, you don't have to do no hair at all, just supervise." But Inez wasn't of a mind to do much of what he said, given all they had been through, so she decided to forego hairdressing after all. She would never work at it a day in her life. Instead, she took a short nursing course and got a job at a hospital to show her independence, to spite him, or both. George had escaped Florida, but he could not run away from the frustrations of an impulsive, ill-advised marriage. Inez had arrived in Harlem, but nothing had changed. They were getting along no better than before. So when he wasn't on the rails, he began to fall under Harlem's spell, like many of the new arrivals suddenly free of the South. Between the people he knew from back in Florida and the coworkers he met riding the rails, he had a ready-made set of diversions every night of the week in a place that never shut down and was spilling over with people. It was said that Harlem was one of the most crowded places in all of the country. Some 500,000 colored people were crammed into a sliver of upper Manhattan that was about 50 blocks long and only 7 or 8 blocks wide. A 1924 study by the National Urban League confirmed what colored tenants already knew, that colored renters paid from 40% to 60% higher rents than white tenants for the same class of apartment. So colored people in Harlem took in boarders and worked second and third jobs. Beginning in World War I, as many as 7,000 people were estimated to be living in a single block in Harlem. The crush of people begging for space forced rents even higher in what became a landlord's paradise. Cash-strapped renters looked for new ways to make their rent. They began throwing end-of-the-month parties where they drank bathtub gin, ate pig knuckles, and danced with the lights off, as Arna Bontemps wrote. They called them rent parties. They charged 25 cents admission for a few hours of smoke-hazed, gin-juiced, tom-tom caterwauling and poker playing with people from back home and with worldly-wise northerners they did not know, just to help make that month's rent. Up and down the side streets off Lenox and 7th Avenues, people flung open their apartment doors the Saturday night before the rent was due. They served pork chops and pig's feet and potato salad, just like down south, except that the food and spirits were for sale, and they put Count Basie on the record player to give people something to dance to. Total strangers looking for a good time could stroll down the block looking for a red, pink, or blue light in a window and listening for the rabble of a rent party in progress. Signs went up inviting anybody willing to pay. One read, "There'll be brown-skinned mamas, high yallas too, and if you ain't got nothing to do, come on up to Roy and Sadie's, West 126th Street, Saturday night, May 12th. There'll be plenty of pig feet and lots of gin. Just ring the bell and come on in." Tenants stood to make the most money if they got the party-goers playing poker, and George was all for it. There were some people from Eustis, Florida living up on 7th Avenue between 146th and 147th Streets. They lived right next door to each other and started running their parties simultaneously. "We just go from one house to the other," George said. "We get tired of playing over to Freeman's, or we get mad with them about something, and we go over to MB's. We go from one house to the other. We would be gambling the whole weekend. When they got tired of the people on 7th Avenue, they went over to the Bronx, where the Bly brothers had a sister named Henry living over at 3rd Avenue and 17th Street, and played some more. The wives and girlfriends served the gin and bourbon and the grits and eggs and biscuits and smoked pork from the pork store down the street, the big poker players never getting up from the table, shoveling forkfuls of grits into their mouths between hands. They were playing 5-card stud, and sometimes there were so many people there'd be 2 or 3 games running. People just in or visiting from Eustis and Ocala, people who had been in Harlem for years, hustlers who made a life out of circulating at the gambling tables of the rent parties to beat the tenants out of their own rent money. It was an open invitation, after all. George saw the money they were making. Some of them were pulling in hundreds of dollars a weekend, and decided to throw some parties himself. He went in with his friend Babe Bly, one of the Bly brothers from back home in Florida. There were 9 brothers in all, plus 3 girls that the parents had given boys' names to, but that's another story. Babe was working as an auto painter for General Motors in New York, and was living upstairs from George and Inez in the brownstone George was buying. Sometimes Inez served food, sometimes she wouldn't, sometimes she would stay down in their apartment. Working the rails mostly for tips, George could use the extra money for the house note and went in with Babe to run some poker parties. George figured out the system. If you stay out of the game, and if you run a game for 4 or 5 hours or more, you're going to have most of the money, George said. You're going to have most of the money and the cut, because most of the players are going to lose. Trouble was, Babe couldn't just sit back and watch. See, that was our weakness, George said. Babe couldn't stay out of the game. He just had to get in the game, and he'd lose pretty near everything that we take in. Like most migrants from the South, George had surrounded himself with the people he knew from back in the old country. But the old country was still in the people, no matter where they went, and George found that as much as he loved the people from back home, he could never truly move up with the country people still acting country. He never put it in so many words, but he didn't keep his resentment to himself. We done sat up here all night, and you done gambled all the money out of the cut box, he told Babe. We just set this whole thing up for nothing, and now we got to clean up and see how many cigarette spots somebody done burned in the furniture. And we don't have a thing to show for it. Then one night, George had had enough. They were gambling upstairs in Babe's apartment. They had a big game going, and Babe and George were both in the game. George looked to be winning the pot when Babe called him. 2 men they didn't know, and who looked to have been in Harlem much longer than George and Babe, were in the game, as often happened when the migrants threw open their doors to make extra money to make ends meet. George caught Babe dealing off the bottom of the deck. He hit himself from the bottom with an ace, giving himself a better hand than everyone else. Babe had cheated to win the pot, but it did not appear that the 2 other men had caught on. I couldn't say anything because of the other guys in the game, George said. If they caught you cheating, some of them guys would kill you right on the spot. So I had to sit there and let Babe go with that. I lost $30 down the deal. George made a show of borrowing $30 from the pot. Well, I'm borrowing $30, he said to no one in particular, figuring Babe would get the message that George was onto his cheating and wanted him to stop. That was for the benefit of the other guys around the table, not to become suspicious, George said. When the game was over, George headed downstairs. Babe called out to him. Hey, son, you know you owe me $30. I do? George asked. Let me tell you one thing. I will never in life play with you again, because you dealt yourself off the bottom with an ace that beat my hand, and the only reason I let you go, I didn't want you to get me and you both killed, because there were other people in the game. And you know the rule is, if you caught cheating, you in trouble. Now, I don't want no killing in the house. It might have been me. So I had to let you go with that. George wasn't finished. Didn't you hear me saying I'm borrowing $30 out the pot? I took my money out that I lost. I don't owe you nothing. You owe me your life, 'cause if I had squawked about you dealing off the bottom, you and I both might have got killed. He told Babe, who was after all his tenant, that he was through with him when it came to gambling. I ain't gonna never pay you, George said, and furthermore, I ain't gonna never gamble with you no more. If you can't gamble with your friends without being cheated, who can you gamble with? That was the end of George's short, unhappy career running a gambling den. He wasn't making money, and now it was dangerous. The city had a way of bringing out the best and now the worst in everyone. People got up to the big city and either forgot where they came from and took on the meanest aspects of a hard life, or kept a kind of sweet country blindness and fell victim to what looked to be city charms, but could be traps if you weren't wise to them. Or they somehow managed to keep the best of both worlds, keep the essential goodness of the old culture and the street wit of the new. George had to learn to recognize that admixture in the people who surrounded him, even as he tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to do the same himself. Los Angeles, June 1953. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. Robert had been in California for a couple of months now, taking whatever work Dr. Beck threw his way and doing physicals for Golden State Insurance. He had set aside some of what he had been making and was starting to feel he could pull a practice together, what with all the people he was meeting through Golden State. He decided it was time he got an office of his own. He could never get ahead on those $10 physicals, and he wouldn't be able to make the most of Dr. Beck's referrals or treat any patients without an office they could come to. Besides, Alice and the girls were wanting to know when they could come out to California, and the Clements, just waiting for him to fall short, wanted to know what was taking him so long, since he had raved so much about the place before he had seen it. Robert didn't want an office in the predictable places where colored businesses went. He didn't want to be in Compton or Watts or South Central. He wanted to be as far north as he could afford, which wouldn't be but so far north given his resources, and wouldn't be practical anyway, given where his current roster of potential patients was living. He wanted a location with some prestige, so he could live out the California dream he had in his head and justify the fees he thought he deserved, not knowing that a shot of penicillin generally went for $5 no matter where you were. He went driving around the West Side looking for the right kind of place for himself. He found an office to let at 959 West Jefferson, well west of Central Avenue, right across the street from the University of Southern California campus. He could always say he was near Southern Cal, and he liked the sound of that. It was a ground-floor suite at the front of an office building with a dentist upstairs and a doctor and an Asian import-export company on the ground floor with him. The office directly behind his was occupied by an internist from Los Angeles, who was neither willing to nor interested in extending himself to this newcomer just in from the South, as seemed to be the distancing and disdainful attitude of many of the people who happened to have gotten to the North or West first, or had the advantages of having grown up outside the walls of Jim Crow. The internist had come from a completely different world, an integrated world that Robert both distrusted and envied, a world he could only hope his young daughters could grow to master and benefit from, but not completely lose themselves in one day. The building was just a few blocks south of the apartment on Ellendale he had secured for himself and his family until they could afford the house everyone expected of him. Everything finally seemed to be coming together. That office was where he would start his new life. And it was a beautiful building, Robert said. It had a nice marquee in front of it. My office was at the front of the building, and my name was on the window, beautifully etched. He put a deposit on an X-ray machine and the draperies for the office, a desk in the waiting room, chairs for the patients he hoped to attract. Now that he was nearly established, the people from Monroe turned out. Lemuel Jordan and his wife Adeline came and helped him set up the office. "We built his operating table in a room over there," Lemuel would remember. Howard Beckwith, a friend from back home, built furniture and opened his line of credit for Robert to use to get on his feet. Lemuel loaned him money, too. They all made sure he ate. "Come on, Doc. You can't practice on your empty stomach," they said. "You gotta eat." Mrs. Beck and her daughter Vivian planned an open house for that July. They supplied the linens, the lace tablecloths, the crystal punch bowls. They made the punch and refreshments and served as hostesses in their cinched waist dresses and pumps. "I spent my last dime buying whiskey at Mick's for the open house," Robert said. "We had 2/5 of whiskey." He invited 20 people. The friends from Morehouse and Spelman and Atlanta University all came out, and Robert was in business. He called Alice to say it was time. He was ready for them to join him in Los Angeles. They had been waiting in Atlanta for him to give them the word. The girls were growing up fast, and he had missed most of it. Bunny was 9 already, and Robin was 7. He was all packed and ready to receive them. He would move out of the Becks and into an apartment a few blocks north of his new office. But when it came time to actually move in, the manager told him she was sorry, but it was already rented to somebody else. "That was my introduction to the deception of California," he said. Alice and the girls had come all this distance, and he didn't have a place for them. He had to scramble to find something else before word got back to the Clements. He heard about a Dr. Anderson he knew from back in Louisiana who happened to be moving out of his apartment. It was on St. Andrew's Place, near the Becks. It had 2 bedrooms. It was a far cry from Hickory Hill, the president's mansion back at Atlanta University, where Alice and the girls had been living. But the family would be together for the first time since Austria. "And he rented it to me for my family," Robert said. Alice set about making the apartment a home, while Robert began building a practice. He discovered he was having trouble attracting his most obvious patient base. For some reason, even with the new office on the fashionable side of town, the people from back home, from Monroe and from his days at Morehouse and Alice's days at Spelman, weren't coming. They had shown up for the hors d'oeuvres and whiskey at the open house, but they weren't coming in for appointments. "Some were going to white doctors," he would say years later. "But not all of them went to white doctors. I really don't know who they were going to. I wasn't really interested in who they were going to. I wanted them to come to me." He figured he was a hometown patient's dream. He was board certified in surgery, but was doing family practice, knew their family histories, could talk their language, and, as he had done all his life, would do just about anything to please them. But among the gumbo recipes and family Bibles they brought to California were the petty rivalries from back in Louisiana. People had long memories, and if Professor Foster had taken a switch to them without cause, or Robert's mother had been too hard on them in the 7th grade, or if one of the Fosters had happened not to speak to them at Zion Baptist Church one Sunday back in 1932, they remembered it and carried it with them across the desert to California. And that wasn't all. Some of the middle-class people from back in Monroe, the insurance agents and teachers and sales clerks, seemed to resent even the early signs of success and the fact that he was wanting people to call him Robert instead of Pershing after all these years. They seemed to be second-guessing him more than his other patients did. They questioned the motives of his every instruction and stood up to him like they did when they were back in the 3rd grade, especially when it came to surgery. "See, they got lots of time before they get on the table," Robert remembered. "They can think a whole lot. They can get another consultation. They'd be quick to say, 'I'll get another consultation.' Or somebody would say, 'What you trying to do, buy a mink coat for Alice?' Now that slaps you. People can be little." The rejection hurt him and gnawed at him. It stayed with him for decades. He set out to prove he could make it without them. He would be the very best doctor he knew how. He would focus not on the grudging people from Monroe, but on the people who wanted him as their doctor. He would put on a show so they wouldn't forget him. He would pull in more of the cooks and laborers from Texas and the Mardi Gras celebrating people from New Orleans and Baton Rouge, who would appreciate his loud suits and stingy brim hats and folksy, one-of-the-people bedside manner. The people from Monroe would learn how wrong they had been. To bend in strange winds. I was a Southerner, and I had the map of Dixie on my tongue. Zora Neale Hurston, Dust Tracks on a Road. Chicago, late 1938. Ida Mae Brandon Gladney. There was a knock on the door at Ida Mae's tiny flat one afternoon when she was at home alone taking care of the children. It was a neighbor lady who had taken notice of the new family just up from Mississippi, seen that the young mother was by herself with the little ones much of the time, the husband likely off to work somewhere, and the neighbor lady was saying she had come to introduce herself. Ida Mae thought it was awfully nice of the lady to drop by. She hadn't been in Chicago long, as the woman likely knew. George had secured the apartment, while Ida Mae was in Mississippi giving birth to Eleanor. On days when there was no work to be had, Ida Mae was cooped up in the kitchenette apartment far from home in a big, loud city she didn't yet know. She was used to wide-open spaces, trees everywhere, being able to see the sun set and rise, and the sky stretched out over the field. She was used to killing a chicken if she needed one, not lining up at a butcher and paying for it in pieces with money she didn't have. As much as she hated picking cotton, she missed her sisters-in-law and the other families on the plantation and her mother and younger sister. She didn't know too many people in Chicago yet, and was isolated with only little James and Eleanor with her during the day, as Velma was off in grade school. So Ida Mae welcomed the neighbor lady and invited her in to sit a while. The lady had brought something with her. It was a bottle of homemade wine. Ida Mae had never had wine before. George didn't believe in it, and Ida Mae never had occasion to try it.
This is the end of disc number 10. Please insert disc number 11.
The woman opened the bottle and poured some for the two of them to drink while they talked. Ida Mae took a few sips and started feeling woozy as the woman asked her how she'd gotten there. The woman learned all about how Ida Mae's family first tried Milwaukee and how Ida Mae went back to Mississippi to have the baby when George told her he was going to try Chicago. The woman poured more wine, and Ida Mae got giddy and lightheaded. She had never felt this way before. The woman was from Mississippi, but had been in Chicago for some time, had gotten to know the city's virtues and vices, and how a city resident, which Ida Mae now was, should comport herself. She told Ida Mae that now that she was in the North, she shouldn't wear her headscarf out in public. That was for back when she was in the field. That she shouldn't hang her wet laundry out the front window, even though there was no place else to let the linens dry out in the open sun like back home. That she should make sure the kids had shoes on when they went out, even though the kids hated shoes, and shoes cost money they didn't have. Ida Mae told the lady she appreciated that advice, but soon she wasn't comprehending much of anything the neighbor lady was saying. When the bottle of wine was finished, the lady said she'd better be heading back home. George came home soon after the neighbor lady left. He found Ida Mae giggling and slurring her words, talking gibberish, and the children needing to eat and get their diapers changed. She told him that a nice neighbor lady had stopped by and that she had tried some of the wine the lady brought. George was furious. The devilment of the city had come right into his home, as hard as he tried to protect his family from it. Ida Mae was too sweet-natured to recognize when someone might be taking advantage, and wasn't wise to the machinations of the people who had preceded them to Chicago. She wouldn't have noticed if they made fun of them, looked down on them, or took pleasure in seeing the simple country people fall under the city's spell. He had to make it clear to Ida May that she was not to just let anybody in. This was Chicago, after all. He told her he didn't want that lady coming around anymore, and that Ida May wasn't to drink any more wine, which was a sin in his estimation anyway. When Ida May came to her senses, she was shamefaced about what had happened. She was waking up to the ways and the people of the North. She soon learned that the colored people who had gotten there before her and had assimilated to the city didn't look too kindly upon her innocent country ways. In the receiving cities of the North and West, the newcomers like Ida May had to worry about acceptance or rejection not only from whites they encountered, but from the colored people who arrived ahead of them, who could at times be the most sneeringly judgmental of all. The northern-born colored people and the long-standing migrants who were still trying to keep their footing in the new world often resented the arrival of the unwashed masses pouring in from the very places some of the old-timers had left. As often happens with immigrant groups, some of the old-timers would have preferred to shut the door after they got there to protect their own uncertain standing. The small colony of colored people already in the New World had made a place for themselves as an almost invisible minority by the time the migration began. Many were the descendants of slaves the North had kept before abolition, or of slaves who fled the South on the Underground Railroad, or were among the trickle of pioneers who had migrated from the South in the decades after the Civil War. A good portion were in the servant class, waiters, janitors, elevator operators, maids, and butlers to the wealthiest white families in the city. But some had managed to create a solid, though tenuous, middle class of Pullman porters, postal workers, ministers, and businessmen who were anxious to keep the status and gains they had won. The color line restricted them to the oldest housing in the least desirable section of town, no matter what their class. But they had tried to make the best of it, and had created a world within a world for themselves. From this group came the letters and newspaper stories about the freedoms of the North that helped inspire blacks to leave the South in the first place. The Great Migration brought in many a Northerner's sweetheart, aunts, uncles, siblings, nieces, nephews, parents, and children. It also delivered hundreds of thousands of new customers, voters, readers, patients, and parishioners to the black institutions that stood to profit and be forever changed by the influx. They have been our best patrons, a colored physician in Chicago told researchers studying the migration in the 1930s. We have increased from 5 to 250 doctors. We are living in better homes and have more teachers in the schools, and nearly every colored church has benefited. Businessmen jumped at the opportunity. They opened restaurants serving hog maws and turnip greens. A man named Robert Horton opened Hattiesburg Shaving Parlor in a 5-block stretch along Rhodes Avenue, where some 150 families from that Gulf Coast town were huddled together. A few blocks away, there sat the Mississippi Coal and Wood Company, the Florida East Coast Shine Parlor to pull in the Floridians, and the Carolina Sea Island Candy Store for those who'd made it from there. The migration made giddy landlords of some of the old-timers. It gave them the chance to get extra money and bragging rights, too, by renting their spare rooms and garages to the new people. In Los Angeles and Oakland, it became a status symbol to have the wherewithal to take in rumors. "I got a sharecropper," a woman in Los Angeles was heard boasting. "Honey, I got me 3 sharecroppers," another one said. The churches stood to gain the most, and did. There ran notices in the Defender proclaiming strangers welcome. Walter's African Methodist Episcopal Church in Chicago tripled in membership. The city's Olivet Baptist Church got 5,000 new members in the first 3 years of the migration, making it one of the largest Baptist churches and one of the first mega-churches in the country. A migrant from Alabama said she couldn't get in the first time she went. "We'd have to stand up," she said. "I don't care how early we go, you wouldn't get in." But soon the cultural and class divisions between the newcomers and the old-timers began to surface. Many of the migrants, seeking the status and security they could not get back home, filled the stained-glass sanctuaries of the mainline churches. Others were overwhelmed by the size of the congregations and the austerity of their services. One migrant said she couldn't understand the pastor and the words he used at Olivet and couldn't get used to the singing. The songs was proud-like, she said. A migrant from Louisiana felt out of place at Pilgrim Baptist, another big old-line church. Nobody said nothing, the migrant said, but there were whispers all over the place. The migrants did as much moving around from church to church as they did from flat to flat. They tended to favor smaller storefront churches opened up by ministers fresh from the South, where they could sing the spirituals, catch the spirit, and fan themselves like they were used to. The reason one woman left a mainline church was because it was too large. It don't see the small people. The migrants brought new life to the old receiving stations, but by their sheer numbers, they pressed down upon the colored people already there. Slumlords made the most of it by subdividing what housing there was into smaller and smaller units and investing as little as possible in the way of upkeep to cash in on the bonanza. It left well-suited lawyers and teachers living next to sharecroppers in headscarves just off the Illinois Central. The middle class and professional people searched for a way out. They tried to insulate themselves by moving further south along the narrow strip that defined the gradually expanding South Side Black Belt, wrote the historian James Grossman. But the migrants inevitably followed. Unlike their white counterparts, the old settlers had few places to go and were met with hostility and violence if they ventured into white neighborhoods. The color line hemmed them in, newcomers and old-timers alike, as they all struggled to move up. The same class of Negroes who ran us away from 37th Street are moving out there, a colored professional man said, after moving further south to 51st Street ahead of the migrants. They creep along slowly like a disease. The fate of the city people was linked to that of the migrants, whether they liked it or not, and the city people feared that the migrants could jeopardize the status of them all. A colored newspaper called Searchlight chastised them for boarding the streetcars in soiled work clothes after a day at the stockyards, and accused them of threatening the freedoms colored people had in the North. Don't you know that you are forcing on us here in Chicago a condition similar to the one down south? A survey of new migrants during World War II found that an overwhelming majority of them looked up to the people who were there before them, admired them, and wanted to be as assured and sophisticated as they were. But a majority of the colored people already in the New World viewed the newcomers in a negative light and saw them as hindering opportunities for all of them. The anxious old settlers were like German Jews who in the late 19th century feared that the influx of their co-religionists from Eastern Europe would endanger their marginal but substantial foothold in Gentile Chicago, wrote the historian James R. Grossman. Those who have long been established in the North have a problem, the Chicago Defender acknowledged. That problem is the caring for the stranger within their gates.
Context of White Supremacy. Number to dial for folks who are interested in participating, 760-569-7676. And the code is 564-943#. The number again, 760-569-7676. And the code is 564-943#. Got little confused myself, wondering if that was the end of the clip or not. I think the last paragraph, just making sure it said the anxious old settlers were like German Jews who in the late 19th century feared that the influx of their co-religionists from Eastern Europe would endanger their marginal but substantial foothold in genteel Chicago, wrote the historian James R. Grossman. I think that's where the segment was supposed to conclude. At any rate, Context of White Supremacy. Looking forward. Exchange of views. I will reserve my comments till after folks have had an opportunity to share. The number again is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. We did have a moment where I think the audio went out for a moment. I think there was just a little distortion in the audio clip. I had that portion in the book. I'll make sure I correct that when the archive is uploaded so that it will be there in its entirety. The portion, it was brief, but the portion that got left out, I thought this was important just to make sure that we're all set, and then I'll hit the phone line. That portion that kind of got skipped over, this was back. I was talking about some of the ugliness that happened in Chicago, white terrorism. She wrote, thus, these violent clashes bore the futility of Greek tragedy, yet the situation was even more complicated than the black migrants could have imagined. As they made their way north, so did some of their poorer whites from the south, looking not for freedom from persecution, but for greater economic rewards for their hard work. Slavery and sharecropping, along with the ravages of the boll weevil and floods, had depressed the wages of every worker in the South. The call of the North drew some of the Southern whites the migrants had sought to escape. Initially, they came to the North in great numbers, but they were much more likely to return south than colored Southerners were. Fewer than half of all white Southerners who left actually stayed in the North for good, thus behaving more like classic migrant workers than immigrants. Still, many brought their prejudices with them and melted into the white working class world of ethnic immigrants to make a potent advance guard against black inroads in the North. As a window into their sentiments, a witness to the Detroit riots in 1943 gave this description of a white mob that had attacked colored people in that outbreak. By the conversation of men gathered there, I was able to detect that they were Southerners and they resented Negroes working beside them and receiving the same amount of money, the informant said, adding that these Southern whites believed that the black migrants ought to be taken down a peg or two. Perhaps the earliest indication of what the migrants were unknowingly up against came from an outbreak directly related to the Great Migration, or rather to how the North reacted to the newcomers from the South. These were the riots that erupted in East St. Louis, Illinois, in the summer of 1917, after companies being struck by white workers hired colored migrants to replace them. The migrants were flocking to the city at a rate of 1,000 a month, some 18,000 having arrived that spring, and they instantly became the perfect pawns, an industrialist's dream. I will stop there because I think that's where it picked back up at, but we should all be on the same page now. Nothing missed. I will take hands as I see them. We should have Mr. Demery 4. Your line should be open. If other folks dial in, I will get them as well.
Yes. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, first, I'd like to start out with the report that was done in Chicago, 600 some odd page report. Because of the riots and the racial tension, the city officials felt that something had to be done, so the key word here is white-led commission, biracial, and they, I guess, investigated and came up with came up with some recommendations that should happen. But it seems strange that the first recommendation is that we have to do something about these Negroes, the vices in their communities, prostitution, drugs, illegal vices that's going on. And then, as you go on, there were several recommendations, but the thing about it was, even though this commission came up with these recommendations, they were unable to enforce any of their recommendations, and nothing was ever done. And then it says that it wasn't even disseminated among the citizens. So we did this report. We didn't tell anybody about it. We made some recommendations, but mostly what's going to happen is we're going to come down a little harder on these Negroes, Donnie. Because if they rioting, we're going to have to tighten up on them a little bit more. That's basically what it looked like happened in that report. You know, it gave you the impression that they was doing the report to come up with recommendations that may assist these migrants or black people that were migrating into the area and was dissatisfied. But most of the terroristic acts that were perpetrated against the black people, you'll notice, was started by whites. The incident where the young black man was, he was swimming and he crossed over the line and came into the white area. Well, the instigators were white. When they threw rocks at him, knocked him off of his rail, ended up the kid losing his life. And then when the black people demanded something be done, I believe they arrested a black man behind it. So it's just terrorism in its greatest form. You know, the protagonist, Ida Mae, is naive still, and a friend came to visit her. I guess she was getting lonesome, and then so lady brought some wine over. The thing about it, I looked at this, and it looked like she was giving her some pretty good advice. But Ida Mae has never been exposed to anything. So 3 or 4 glasses of wine, she's tipsy. She's never had it before, so she blew that opportunity. A lot of lonesome people or wives that are at home when their husbands go off to work turn to alcohol, but they manage to hide it from the husband, and then it goes on a bit longer than Ida Mae. She gets busted the first time. She gets tips. But the advice that the lady was giving her seemed to be pretty good advice. But I noted that not only did the new arrivals had to worry about the white people up north, they also had to worry about the blacks that were discontented and that I guess basically was, you know, hating on the new arrivals from the South. And we go to George story, he's kind of, he's a hustler. So he's figured out a way to hustle some bucks with this gambling party. And, you know, he's kind of like a cat with 9 lives. He always gets out of trouble. You know, when his buddy, Babe, starts dealing off the bottom, it could have gotten both of them killed. They round city slick guys, and they're a couple of country guys, and the buddy is dealing off the bottom. And those gambling shacks and those types of parties usually end up on Saturday nights in a cutting, stabbing, or shooting. So I think he dodged another bullet. Then now we're beginning to see problems that are coming into the relationships, the black relationships. Well, let's see, Inez and George's relationship has already been described as colicky. And if you think about a baby crying with colic, then that's describing their marriage. They had some separations. You know, the book kind of briefly goes over it, but they're fighting. And it's just, you know, like a powder keg getting ready to blow up. And Percy is still on his quest to become something. He's determined that he's going to get his family there, and he's going to make it in L.A. In the meantime, his father-in-law is gaining more and more prominence, and it's eating at Pershing. And I think that his jealousy of his father-in-law motivates his determination to succeed. And as a parallel, I know the 80s and 90s, there was a saying about keeping up with the Joneses. So black people have been notorious for being motivated out of jealousy and trying to get what somebody else has or to gain prominence, just like someone that they are acquainted with. I'll mute my line and give someone else a chance. Come back later. Thank you, Gus, for taking my call.
Absolutely. I will check. I think B. Moore might have been trying to participate. She was having some issues with the app to use the free HD line. I'll see if I can add her. She wants to give some feedback as well. Let's see. All right, you might hear a ring in the background. Just hang on.
This service is access code accepted. This conference is being recorded. Q&A session started. You have reached the voicemail box of 704.
All right. I'm not able to get her. I know she was having some difficulties with her free HD app. I think some other people had some problems with that as well. But if you are having issues, you can let me know. We'll see if we can figure out something to corrected. I know some people, they've been able to use it and it's worked out okay. Some people I know it had some problems as well. There are two different ones. There's one if you have a smartphone, and then there's one if you have an iPhone. Two different apps that you can try out if you don't want to use your phone line to dial in. But if you're having difficulties, just let me know. You can drop me an email or what have you, and we will sort it out. My apologies to anyone who is having trouble dialing in the white people's technology not working out correctly. You mentioned that report, the Chicago study. You can actually download that report. It is online. The full report, The Negro in Chicago. I don't want to read the whole section. Again, this is just, check out the footnotes. If you go in the footnotes, she cites where she's getting this material from and the pages that she quoted from, and to go into some of the information about what happened in Chicago specifically. But some of it that I did thought was pretty interesting that I was able to download and look over during the first audio segment. This is on page 77 from that quote-unquote biracial report led by white people, where it says that there had been an automobile of white people that had gone through black neighborhood, terrorizing them and just abusing, assaulting innocent black people. And it says that a second automobile filled with white men came through the black neighborhood later. Negroes by this time had armed themselves. They were out to defend themselves. They were angry after the first assault. And it says the Negroes cursed them, commanded them to drive on, and fired a volley into the machine. The occupants, however, were not the rioters, but policemen and reporters. One policeman was killed, and another was so seriously wounded that he died later. Thousands viewed the riddled car standing before police headquarters. The early editions of the newspapers gave full accounts of the tragedy, and on July 2nd, the rioting began. Negro mobs shot white men and white men and boys, and white men and boys, girls and women began to attack every Negro in sight. I thought that was astounding just because they itemized it and lined it all out. Racist man, racist woman, racist boy, and racist girl. News spread rapidly, and as excitement increased, unimaginable depredations and horrible tortures were committed and viewed with placid unconcern, they have that in quotes, by hundreds. Negro men were stabbed, clubbed, and hanged from telephone poles. Their homes were burned. Women and children were not spared. An instance is given of a Negro child, 2 years old, which was shot and thrown into a doorway of a burning building. Just for folks who are longtime listeners to the C.O.W.S, Eula Biss, racist suspect, white woman, she was on the program all the way back in July of 2009. Her book, Notes from No Man's Land, she said in the book and on the program that she began with an interest in writing a book about communication and how technology and just the evolution of how we communicate with one another. But she says she was doing research and that she was looking at when telephone poles first began to be erected. And she said that she kept running into all these lynchings where a black person was lynched from a telephone pole. And she kept finding them. And this redirected the whole theme of her book to discuss racism. But you can go back and that immediately stood out, having a black person lynched from a telephone pole. But the report goes on. It says, on the night of July 1st, Mayor Molman telephoned to the Adjutant General of Illinois saying that the police were no longer able to handle the situation and requesting that the militia be sent. Both the police and the military severely censored by the congressional report for gross failure to do their duty. Oh, it's not military, militiamen, sorry. The police, says the report, could have quelled the riot instantly, but instead they either fled into the safety of cowardly seclusion or listlessly watched the depredations of the mob, passively and in many instances actively sharing in the work. That's all in quotes. In all, 5 companies of the Illinois National Guard were sent to East St. Louis. Some of them arrived on the morning of July 2nd, the first at 8:40 a.m. These forces were in command of Colonel S.O. Tripp. Concerning the conduct of the militia, the Congressional Committee reported in strong terms, singling out Colonel Tripp for a special condemnation. It said that he was a hindrance instead of a help to the troops, that he was ignorant of his duties, blind to his responsibilities, and deaf to every intelligent appeal that was made to him. The troops, in the estimation of the committee, were poorly officered and in only a few cases did their duty. The report states that they seemed moved by the same spirit of indifference or cowardice that marked the conduct of the police force. As a rule, they fraternized with the mob, joked with them, and made no serious effort to restrain them. Many instances are given of active participation and encouragement of the mob in its murders, arson, and general destruction. The only redeeming feature of the activities of the militia, according to the Congressional Committee, was the conduct, bravery, and skill of the officer second in command, whose promptness and determination prevented the mob from committing many more atrocities. By 8 o'clock on the evening of July 2nd, there were 17 officers and 270 men on duty, and by July 4th, the force had increased to 37 officers and 1,411 men. On the evening of July 2nd, the fury of the mob had spent itself and the riot subsided. The behavior of the troops was condemned not only by the Congressional Committee, but by citizens generally, and a special inquiry was made into their conduct by the Military and Naval Department of the state of Illinois. Witnesses to the dereliction of duty on the part of the soldiers were examined, and commanding officers of troops were asked to testify and explain specific acts of violence and neglect of duty. In all, 79 persons were examined, although the charges against the soldiers in a large number of cases were serious and sufficient to warrant the criticism which they received. Identification of individuals guilty of these acts was difficult. This probably accounts for the fact that only 7 court-martials resulted from the inquiry. The commanding officer, though severely censured by the Congressional Committee, was exonerated by this inquiry. I will stop there. I just thought that was fascinating to get more detail. This is not the first time that we've talked about the 1919 riot in Chicago or all of the other riots, because there were tons of them all over the country. Washington, D.C., Arkansas, Mississippi, Chicago, as we mentioned, happening all over the country. Red Summer, Cameron McWhorter's book, Racist Suspect, he was on the program in October of 2011. And he goes into more detail about this event, what took place, and the numbers of black people that were harmed, abused, breaking into black people's homes, and just all sorts of white terrorism. But at any rate, some of the other things that stuck out really quick, if anyone, do not wait till the last minute. I'll say that again. If folks don't have any thoughts on the first section, that's fine. But don't wait till the last minute once we get to the second audio section and decide that you have comments or there's something that you want to share. Some of the other things that stood out from the first passage, I think Mr. Demrifor, he touched on how some of the black people in these areas in the so-called North, how they were not necessarily friendly or receptive to some of the black people that came in. And I think there were 2 passages that stood out in particular. One of them was with Dr. Pershing. The other was with Ida Mae, where Dr. Pershing, he was talking about how the black people that he knew from Louisiana that had also migrated out to California, he thought, hey, I'll have ready-made clientele. Of course they'll want me to be their doctor. I know them, I know the language and the whole nine, and that turned out not to be the case. He says, I'll read a little bit. He says he figured he was a hometown patient's dream. He was board certified in surgery, but was doing family practice, knew their family histories, could talk their language, and, as he had done all his life, would do just about anything to please them. But among the gumbo recipes and family Bibles they brought to California were the petty rivalries from back in Louisiana. People who had long memories, and if Professor Foster had taken a switch to them without cause, or Robert's mother had been too hard on them in the 7th grade, or if one of the Fosters had happened not to speak to them at Zion Baptist Church one Sunday back in 1932, they remembered it and carried it with them across the desert to California. And that wasn't all. Some of the middle-class people from back in Monroe, the insurance agents and teachers and sales clerks, seemed to resent even the early signs of success and the fact that he was wanting people to call him Robert instead of Pershing after all these years. They seemed to be second-guessing him more than his other patients did. They questioned the motives of his every instruction and stood up to him like they did when they were back in the 3rd grade, especially when it came to surgery. See, they got lots of time before they get on the table, Robert remembered. They can think a whole lot. They can get another consultation. They'd be quick to say, "I'll get another consultation." Or somebody would say, "What you trying to do? Buy a mink coat for Alice?" Now that slaps you. People can be little. I will stop there, but I thought that just that passage speaks volume. I kept thinking the whole time, black love. Black love. We talk about that all the time. This is not the first time that I have heard reports like this, where black people, the way that we treat each other, all the result of racism, white supremacy. But this is the sort of thing where I think we just need to be honest about that. We have all been contaminated. We're all toxic. What he's talking about, where we'll carry some sort of rivalry or something that we perceive to be a slight or an insult from a black person, and that'll end up being, just for a feud that will last for years, decades, go on, where we're not speaking to this person or willing to mistreat this person, or we want to see this black person fail. If there is any vendetta that should be to the death, it should be with white people. And I just don't see this same sort of, I don't even know what you call it, just stubborn rivalries with white people. In fact, even with Dr. Pershing, where it has the passage about how he wanted to make sure that he moved north. I'll stop here and see if Mr. Demery has other thoughts, or if other folks want to dial in and share anything. But where it says that he didn't want to be in the normal areas where they consider black people to be in California, and Compton, and named Compton specifically. And it says that he had his California dream about what he wanted to do. It says Robert didn't want an office in the predictable places where colored businesses went. He didn't want to be in Compton or Watts or South Central. He wanted to be as far north as he could afford, I assume closer to white people, which wouldn't be but so far north given his resources, and wouldn't be practical anyway given where his current roster or potential patients was living. He wanted a location with some prestige so he could live out the California dream he had in his head and justify the fees he thought he deserved, not knowing that a shot of penicillin generally went for $5, no matter where you were. Just in my view, that right there, I think also speaks volume, the way that we've been conditioned, even though we've been terrorized and abused by whites. He almost, in my view, could have easily wrecked his car and got in a major accident because white people wouldn't allow him to stay at their hotel, and his whole trek from Louisiana all the way to California, but wanting a prestigious practice that was not in the normal colored business sections. He wants to be around white people, not criticizing him. I think most of us have been conditioned to think that way for a variety of reasons, whether we think white people will be in a safer neighborhood, or they might, being in that area might be better for our business, whatever it is. That's just the way that we have been conditioned to behave, to respond to racism, white supremacy. And I think you even see a lot of those behavior patterns still to this day. I guess the last thing I'll share in before I check in with Mr. Demery or any of the other folks if they have anything, where Dr. Pershing Foster, he's talking about the internist that he had to work with him. And he says that the internist had come from a completely different world, an integrated world, I assume having more contact with white people, that Robert both distrusted and envied. A world he could only hope his young daughters could grow to master and benefit from, but not completely lose themselves in one day. I thought that was quite a profound passage. I haven't read this book before, but I have a little birdie told me something about his daughters, and there might be some trouble around all this. I think that's something that we should just kind of keep a highlight and keep note of as the book progresses. If we hear more information about what happens with his daughters once they get out to this California dream. But I mean, that just right there is the conundrum of racism, white supremacy. It even reminded me a little bit of some of the dialogue that we heard yesterday about so-called white friends, where these individuals, you want acceptance from them, you want them to respect you and treat you nicely, and even to have that boost to your self-esteem. Oh, I have white friends. I have white people who, have some regard for me, but at the same time, they're white. They're racist. I don't really trust these people just knowing what I know about them. Really difficult situation to be in as victims of racism. I will pause there. I still don't see other hands. If folks have comments that they want to share, I guess we'll go another 10 minutes and then I'll play the second audio clip. So you should get your hand up if you have something you want to share. Mr. Demery Ford, do you have anything else you wanted to touch on?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, one other thing I noticed is that these reports and even white people talking to blacks was trying to exaggerate a division between the immigrants and the northern-born blacks. They made a distinction between that. If you remember in the book, they gave, southern-born blacks were more likely to be employed, and this and that. By the time you come up with all of these differences, then you've got some strife developing between northern blacks resenting the southern blacks, and then you got the white person in the middle that's agitating this thing. So that's just something that I noticed, but also I've noticed in present day when a black person tries to start his own business, other blacks won't even patronize his business. And it's just something about this anti-blackness that we have to get a hold on, because it's almost like if you're a black person, you want to start a business in a black community, you need to at least put some white people up front. I think we had a reference to some church where the minister wanted white greeters. It gets to be pathological after a while. But we have to start noticing this, and we have to start trying to make some effort to do something about the way that our minds are working as we respond to the system of white supremacy. I have a question, though, I'd like to ask you concerning Inez. Now, I believe that Inez wanted to do hair. She wanted a beauty salon. And George was going to make sure that that happened. And because of the acidity in their relationship, when George was offering to assist her in finding a beauty shop or helping her along with her goals, all of a sudden she didn't want to do that. So I'm wondering, I don't understand that. And I was wondering maybe if you could, help me or some of the other callers. What is going on in Inez's mind that when she's almost want to realize her goals, then all of a sudden, because of resentments, all of a sudden now she don't want to do it.
I think there was a passage, if I'm remembering correctly. I guess number one, I would kind of start with a general reminder. I think this book is so long. I think it's good to kind of have a refresher from time to time just about how these people got to where they ended up at. I think with Inez and George, this marriage started out of spite. George was trying to get back at his father because he didn't want to pay his tuition so that he could finish his college education. That's where this attempted marriage started at. And I think you had said that I think that could be some foreshadowing to this not being a happy, productive union, seeing that this didn't really start out of anything sincere, like, hey, let's get married based on how we feel about each other and we think we can try to work this thing out and make this work. This started as, I'm going to try and get at my father. So keeping that in mind, but I think she writes that once they got to New York, that there was I guess some resentment, or Inez might have been upset because George was not able to spend as much time with her, which I think had come up a couple times before when he was initially trying to get money to save to pay for her to go to school to do hair. He was out doing the cab service, and she seemed to be upset about that. He was away for long hours, long parts of the day. She wasn't seeing him. I think other black people had been saying that he was running around with some other girl. They had been saying that, he's having an affair. He's got some other girl. When he went to Detroit to try to make money, it didn't take her with him at first. When the riot happened in 43, I think there was already some tension about that. So I think there already are a lot of seeds for this whole relationship having some animosity between them. And I think Isabel Wilkerson, I think she says that Inez, when she decided that she was not going to do hair, that she was going to go ahead and do, I think it was nursing or something where she could get a job at a hospital, that this was kind of to be independent and or to spite him, where it could have been a combination of both. This way I have a little doing something where I can make a little bit of money on my own, where I don't have to be dependent on George for my finances, and I can kind of thumb my nose at him like, I'm not going to do the hair thing. I'm not going to do what you had set out to do, and you were trying to save and get me to do this. I'm going to do something completely different. I mean, that just could be another manifestation of anti-blackness when it all boils down. But I think there's been a lot of tension in their attempted partnership, throughout, just how they ended up getting married to begin with, and then them not necessarily being able to spend a lot of time together for various reasons. He's working, trying to save money. Oh, this is the passage right here where, let's see, this is, Inez wasn't off of mind to do much of what he said, given all they had been through. So she decided to forego hairdressing after all. She would never work at it a day in her life. Instead, she took a short nursing course and got a job at a hospital to show her independence, to spite him, or both. So I think that right there, I think speaks volume, at least to me, about why she might have chosen to forego the whole hair thing.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah. That is it in a nutshell. And, what happened is, when the migrants went up north, there was another set of problems up north that was waiting on them. They were unaware of things like unions being in place, and so they're coming up looking for jobs, and the company owners, in order to break a strike, would hire some of these migrants, and the migrants would be unaware that they were scabs, and that they were actually creating a problem just by trying to solve their own problem on getting a job and meeting some of the goals that they wanted to obtain. And, it's like, when I was young, I remember an old fellow telling me, never go on a job green. And for a lot of years, I didn't know what he was talking about. And then, as the years went by, it dawned on me. You need to know, have knowledge of an occupation that you want to pursue. So when he said, don't go on a job green, that meant you should know something about whatever you plan to do. And I think the same thing would apply with the migrants coming up north. You know, if they had a little bit more knowledge about what was going on, you know, from relatives who had went before them, or some of the other people from that particular area. That may be why they formed clubs, you know, so that they could do a think tank and they could share ideas and assist each other in the learning process about the differences up north and from where they were from.
Excellent point, especially about those clubs. We've been touching on the anti-blackness, and rightly so. There's plenty of it to touch on, but the clubs that they formed, she mentions that quite a bit in a lot of her interviews, how they have, they'll have like a Greenwood club in Chicago and a Monroe, Louisiana club in Chicago or in California, and all these different just groups of people that moved all from the same area. And there's so many of them that they have enough to have a little club where they can get together and talk and swap stories, that sort of thing. I think that is super important. Just that right there to me seems like some effort at codification and trying to work together, be constructive, sharing good information, job tips, resources, that sort of thing. It seems like there was a lot of that all over. Even I think 2 weeks ago, when Dr. Robert Pershing Foster, when he was doing his drive to California, it talked about how they had the little pamphlets, even though it was kind of raggedy. The code, Mr. Fuller, he says sometimes our code is a little raggedy. They would have a little pamphlet that had the rest stops for black people and where you could go to get a room for a night, even if it was just a rooming house or what have you. And sometimes it might be outdated and the person, you know, that was running it might not even be there when you get there. But it seems like there was at least some effort at having some sort of code back when white terrorism was just much more explicit with regards to what black people were having to deal with just out of necessity. You didn't have a choice but to make some effort at trying to codify and share resources as best you could. Hopefully there'll be some more information now that all of the main characters have got to their new spots. Hopefully there'll be some more information about these clubs, because she mentions them almost in every interview that she does. She talks about these clubs and how even that's how she met some of these people that ended up in the book. She would go to some of these meetings at these clubs in California and Chicago and other places, and that's how she found some of the folks who participated in this migration. I guess other quick point I'll get in, we'll see if there's a final quick sentence, anyone wants to get in before we get to the second audio report. I know I say consistently that I have been greatly retarded under the system of racism, white supremacy, and I think Mr. Fuller says that. It's in the code book. That's what the system of white supremacy is designed to do. Retard, hamper, impair the growth, development of all non-white people, to keep us from being universal man, universal woman. And I thought it was right on the money. The passage where talking about the strikes that you just mentioned in the unions says, once the strike was over, the colored migrants, resented by the white unions and unprotected by the plants that had hired them, paid the price. One union wrote its members that the immigration of the Southern Negro into our city for the past 8 months has reached a point where drastic action must be taken, and demanded that the city retard this growing menace and devise a way to get rid of a certain portion of those who are already here. Like I said, sometimes that is just, wow, that's the way you want it, when white people are just being very honest, very explicit about the way they want to deal with what they perceive to be their nigger problem. And I mean, that's the sort of thing you don't hear white people speak that bluntly as frequently right now. But that, man, I made sure to highlight and note that, particularly the use of the word retard. There was one other quick point. I want to see if I can find it without taking up too much time. Mr. Demery, did you have anything final that you wanted to note before we get to the second audio portion?
Yes. One final note was that when the migrants came up north, they would probably try to seek some type of solace inside of the churches, and then the churches created another problem for them, because up north the preachers were more refined in their mannerism and their speech and their deceptiveness as far as trying to get that offering from the migrants, and they probably wasn't used to that. That reminds me of car wash, the Daddy Rich. You had those smooth operators, and they had mega churches, or they were the beginning of the mega church, and they were all about that money. And so the migrants could not, I think it was Ida Mae, somebody couldn't understand the words that they were using. The churches were too big. She did everything, thought of everything, but the fact that those people, a lot of them, were probably wolves in sheep clothing, so that they were cashing in on white Jesus. I just wanted to mention that. I'll mute my line.
Great point. They talked about that. Seems like a lot of the black churches came up big time with that influx of black people. The passage that I wanted to make sure I shared before the session, before we get to the second audio segment. Also, we had a listener who shared that I think they said that the app, if you have an iPhone, that it does not work if you have the brand new iPhone. I do not have an iPhone, so that's a problem I don't have. But if you are fortunate, I guess, to have a brand new iPhone, the app doesn't work at this time. But the listener said that she wrote the folks about this problem, and they're supposed to be working on it. So perhaps it will be something that's corrected in the near future. But if you have the newest iPhone, the iPhone app for the Free HD does not work. The final passage I wanted to make sure I got in before we get to the second audio segment. This is, it stands for itself. Unlike their white counterparts, the old settlers, talking about old black people that were there longer, had moved first with regards to migrating north. The old settlers had few places to go and were met with hostility and violence if they ventured into white neighborhoods. The color line hemmed them in, newcomers and old-timers alike, as they all struggled to move up. The same class of Negroes who ran us away from 37th Street are moving out there, a colored professional man said after moving further south to 51st Street ahead of the migrants. They creep along slowly like a disease. The language of white supremacy. I just thought that was astounding, referencing other black people as a disease to be avoided at all costs, trying to escape them, and they continue to follow me. Psychological terrorism, anti-blackness, as I said, there are tons of it on display throughout this book. That's just a part of our victimization. Something, as I think Demery Ford said, we should just be on guard about and expect. That is what the system of white supremacy is designed to produce. At any rate, we'll get to the second audio segment. If you didn't get to participate, just make a note of whatever it is you wanted to share, write it down, and we should have ample time after the second segment concludes. Context of White Supremacy, Isabel Wilkerson, The Warmth of Other Suns, audio segment number 2.
It turned out that the old-timers were harder on the new people than most anyone else. Well, their English was pretty bad, a colored businessman said of the migrants who flooded Oakland and San Francisco in the 40s, as if from a foreign country. To his way of looking at it, they needed 8 or 9 years before they seemed to get Americanized. As the migrants arrived in the receiving stations of the North and West, the old-timers wrestled with what the influx meant for them, how it would affect the way others saw colored people, and how the flood of black Southerners was a reminder of the Jim Crow world they all sought to escape. In the days before emancipation, as long as slavery existed, no freed black was truly free. Now, as long as Jim Crow and the supremacy behind it existed, no blacks could ever be sure they were beyond its reach. One day, a white friend went up to a longtime Oakland resident named Eleanor Watkins to ask her what she thought about all the newcomers. "Eleanor," the woman said, "you colored people must be very disgusted with some of the people who have come here from the South and the way they act." "Well, Mrs. S.," Eleanor Watkins replied, "yes, some colored people are very disgusted, but as far as I'm concerned, the first thing I give them credit for is getting out of the situation they were in. Maybe they don't know how to dress or comb their hair or anything, but their children will, and their children will." In the early years of the migration, the Chicago Defender took it upon itself to help correct the country people it had helped lure to the North to better fit the city people's standard of refinement. "It is our duty," the Defender wrote, "to guide the hand of a less experienced one, especially when one misstep weakens our chance for climbing." The Defender ran periodic lists of do's and don'ts that recirculated over time and were repeated to newcomers like Ida May. Don't hang out the windows. Don't sit around in the yard and on the porch barefoot and unkempt. Don't wear handkerchiefs on your head. Don't use vile language in public places. Don't allow children to beg on the streets. Don't appear on the street with old dust caps, dirty aprons, and ragged clothes. Don't throw garbage in the backyard or alley or keep dirty front yards. The Chicago Urban League, which helped direct migrants to temporary shelter, rental options, and jobs, was the closest the migrants got to customs in the North. It held what it called strangers' meetings to help acclimate the newcomers, and its members went door to door, passing out leaflets advising the migrants as to their behavior and comportment. To the Defender's do's and don'ts, the Urban League distributed cards adding the following admonishments. 1. Do not loaf. Get a job at once. 2. Do not live in crowded rooms. Others can be obtained. 3. Do not carry on loud conversations in streetcars and public places. 4. Do not keep your children out of school. 5. Do not send for your family until you get a job. Ida May didn't take it personally when people pointed these things out to her, like the neighbor lady who had brought the wine. Ida May wouldn't likely have seen her again because the family moved so much in those early months in Chicago. But she thanked people like her and a lady who mentioned her headscarf on the bus one day. She was grateful for the advice and, in fact, took most of it. But there were some things she was not ever going to do. She was never going to change her name to something citified and highfalutin. She was never going to take on northern airs and name-drop about the pastor she knew from this or that church, or the alderman who stopped to greet her at the polls, even though she would come to know famous people who made good up in the North because she had known their kin people back in Mississippi. She was never going to forget the folks back home and how she loved them so. She was never going to change her Mississippi drawl, not in the least, not even after she had spent more of her life in the North than in the South, not even when some Northerners still had trouble understanding her, decades after she'd been there. Though she wasn't trying to be difficult and was just being herself, she simply didn't care what anybody thought. It didn't matter, because people seemed to love her for it. She decided to keep the things that made her feel like home deep within herself, where nobody could judge her, and inside the walls of their kitchenette apartment, where she made turnip greens and peach cobbler and sweet potato pie flecked with nutmeg, and sang spirituals like in Mississippi as often as she liked. New York, January 1947. George Swanson Starling. It took 8 years of marriage, broken by fearsome silences and fitful separations due to George's work on the railroad and the circumstances under which he had to migrate north. But finally, George and Inez had a baby. It was a boy. He was born in January 1947, and they named him Gerard. There were already enough Georges in the family, and Gerard was close enough. "I was the happiest man in the world when this boy came," George said. "I thought we weren't going to never have no children." George couldn't stop taking pictures of the baby, and the arrival of their son gave Inez a new purpose. She threw herself into motherhood. That was a good thing, because soon after the baby was born, George had to take to the road again to care for his growing family. In no time, George was back on the rails working the legendary trains that followed the East Coast route of the Great Migration. His job put him in the middle of one of the biggest population shifts in the country's history. He saw firsthand the continuing stream of people pouring out in front of him. He helped them carry their cardboard boxes tied with string, the hand-me-down suitcases, the hat boxes, and steamer trunks. Some came north with only a cotton sack or a paper bag with all they owned, or were able to get out with. "Time they get their seat and their bags up. Here come the shoe boxes," he said. Fried chicken, boiled eggs, crackers, and cakes. He was working the Silver Comet from New York to Birmingham, the Silver Spur from New York to Tampa, and the other Great Migration trains. His job was to help people load their bags, direct them to their seats, warm their babies' milk, and generally attend to their needs and clean up after them. The ride could last as long as 28 hours from the southernmost stop to Pennsylvania Station in Manhattan. George walked up and down the train aisles, helping people board or disembark at every stop along the way. He rarely got a chance to sit down, much less sleep. The pay was lower than it might otherwise have been, because he was expected to get tips to compensate for it. But when he was working the Jim Crow car, he was mostly servicing the lowliest, poorest paid workers in the South, or in the country, for that matter. Many of them had never been on the train before, and knew nothing about the protocol of gratuities. They gave him food instead. "Want some fried chicken?" the colored passengers would ask him. "I'll give you some fried chicken. You already getting paid." He had come from the place they were leaving, and knew not to expect a tip or hold it against them. He knew the fear and uncertainty in their hearts, because he had felt it himself. He had ridden the night train north just as they had, and spoke their language, and could read the worried optimism in their faces. When the train approached Washington, D.C., the dividing line between the Jim Crow South and the freed North, and rode deeper into the Promised Land, his role took on an unexpected significance. As they neared the final stops, it became necessary for George to become more than a baggage handler, but tutor and chaperone to nervous charges arriving in the new world. At the moment of the migrants' greatest fear and anxiety, it fell to him to ease them into the Promised Land, tell them whatever he knew about this new place, which bus or subway to take, how far the station was from their cousin's apartment, to watch out for panhandlers and hustlers who might take what little change they had left, and usher them and their luggage off to whatever the future held for them. It was his tap on the shoulder that awakened them as the train neared their stop and alerted them to their new receiving city. He and other colored porters were men in red caps and white uniforms, but they functioned as the midwives of the Great Migration, helping the migrants gather themselves and disembark at the station, and thus delivering to the world a new wave of newcomers with each arriving train. It seemed to George that the moment they stepped on the train going north, they became different people, started acting like what they imagined the people up north to be. Some started talking their version of a northern accent, sitting up straighter, eating their chicken wings with their pinky out, becoming more like the place they were heading to. A lot of them pretending to be always northerners, George said, knowing full well the difference. Heading south, it was a quiet and sober train, filled with the people of the north returning home in their finest suits and hats, and southern visitors having just seen the big city for themselves. Heading north, the trains were more festive and anxious, filled with people migrating out with all their worldly goods, and the people from the north returning to their adopted cities with all they could manage to take with them that they missed from back home in the south. George could tell the people from the north. The bags that were empty heading south were now heavy with ham and hoghead cheese and turnip roots and sweet potatoes and any little thing they cherished from back home and had a hard time getting in the north, or that if they could get it in the north, just didn't taste the same. One day, at a little station somewhere in South Carolina, George helped his passengers get their bags up onto the luggage rack above the seats on the Silver Comet, as he always did. The train then left the station, and George was in the back of the colored rail car. He always liked to stand in the back so he could observe the passengers and see who might need his help. They wanted to assign us seats in the front, George said of the bulkhead crew seats, but I never liked sitting in front of my people. I couldn't see how I could be helpful in the car, sitting in front of everybody. I like to sit behind them so I can see what's happening. That day, after the train left the station in South Carolina, he began to notice the sound of a slow drip hitting the floor of the rail car and the seats below. He looked up and saw that it was coming from a bag up on the luggage rack. Whatever the liquid was, it was red and looked to be blood, and as he got closer he discovered that it was in fact blood dripping out of the bag. They must have just killed a hog or something, cut him up and put him in the bag, George said. I keep hearing something dripping, and I look up, and here's this bag with blood just dripping all out of this bag. They done butchered up somebody's chicken or hog and had him in the bag. They must have done it on the way to the train, and they didn't get rid of all the blood. They were still draining in the bag rack. George was used to people bringing all kinds of things, live chickens and rabbits, a whole side of a pig. But this was the first time someone brought something they hadn't even finished butchering. George took the bag and sat it on the floor. He wiped it down and mopped up the blood that had dripped from it. He never did see whose bag it was, or what kind of animal was inside it, given all that he had to do tending to the train and the other customers. And no passenger claimed the bloody bag for the duration of the trip. In the commotion of arrival at one of the stations up north, the bag just disappeared into the disembarking crowd, its owner having claimed it in anonymity. After a while, nothing surprised George, but he dreaded the work he was in for on the rides north. The bags were so heavy he could barely lift them from the ground. His knees were bad from all the basketball he used to play in high school, and the people, having morphed into northerners just by stepping onto the Silver Comet, were expecting the full rights of citizenship, to begin with George picking up their overloaded bags. They carried jars of fig preserves, pole beans, snap peas, and peaches, whole hams, whatever the folks back home were growing on the farm, and other treasured pieces of the South they could carry back with them. One passenger came on with a big hat box that looked innocent enough, but when George tried to pick it up, the front end flew up, and he could feel something moving inside. When he tried to steady the hat box, the other side flew up. I could feel it going to the front, he said. She had a big old watermelon in there rolling down in the bag. That's why it was flopping back and forth. A man with a trunk boarded at a tiny station somewhere near Abbeville, South Carolina, bound for New York. George saw him and jumped down from the train. "I need some help with my bag," the man said. George reached down to grab the trunk and fell trying to lift it. "Hey, man," George said, "what do you have in this bag?" "Clothes, Daddy, clothes," the man said. "You know, I've been down here for 2 weeks. I had to have something to change in." "Yeah," George said. "Okay, then, if you want your clothes up on this train, you better give me a hand with this bag, 'cause I can't lift it off the ground." Together they pushed it up the steps and shoved it onto the train. The train rocked from side to side as George struggled to drag the trunk down the aisle. It was dark by now, and George managed to push the trunk to the back. He held up one end by the handle to position it in a corner away from the other passengers. Then he dropped it. "And when it hit the floor, the latches flew off," George said. And out came the contents. "The potatoes rolled out that bag, and the engineer is hitting these curves," George said, "and you could hear 'em rolling all over the floor." The man whose trunk it was got alarmed. "Hey, Daddy, you got a flashlight?" he asked. "I don't have no flashlight that's going to last long enough for you to find all your clothes," George said, "'cause they rolling all over the train, and I need my flashlight. I'm sorry, man." The train lurched from side to side and from one curve into the next, and with each curve came the rumbling sound of mud-caked Carolina sweet potatoes. The colored car was in an uproar, the man's trunk flung open, its latch broken, the man running down the aisle in the dark after the contents, and the 51 other passengers rolling with laughter and very likely helping themselves to sweet potatoes they hadn't managed to bring aboard themselves, but that would make a nice sweet potato pie once they got back to Harlem. Los Angeles, 1954. Robert Joseph Pershing Foster. Alice began setting up house in the walk-up apartment Robert had scrambled to secure for his family after the apartment he wanted mysteriously fell through. It was nowhere near the space Alice was accustomed to, and had few of the amenities and not a whiff of the grandeur of her parents' brick Georgian estate back in Atlanta. As she began to arrange what furniture they had, shop for groceries, dust and clean, which she had never in her life really had to do before, and direct their 2 little girls, it soon hit Alice and Robert. They had been married for 12 years, but had never lived together as husband and wife, other than their short tour of duty in Austria, where they had not so much kept house as camped out. Such was the life of ambitious black Southerners trying to find a place for themselves in a not altogether welcoming world. Robert had been in medical training for much of those 12 years of marriage, and the Clements had thought it best that Alice stay with them while Robert pursued his internships and residencies and tried to figure out and save up for where he wanted to migrate. Over the years they had seen each other when they could, but they had both settled into their own ways of doing things, essentially living out their lives on their own. Now that they were finally all together in Los Angeles, it hit them that they didn't really know each other. Alice didn't know how Robert liked his food cooked, or that he was prone to work late hours. Robert had to learn how to be a father to 2 daughters who had been raised by socialite grandparents and who were missing the only world they had ever known. He came to that realization when he was out with his older daughter Bunny one day. She saw a toy she wanted and was insisting that her father buy it for her. Robert had just opened his practice and was watching every nickel. Bunny had been raised like a princess back in Atlanta, and Robert thought she had more than enough toys and dolls as it was. "Why, you don't need that," Robert told her. "Well, if you don't give it to me, Granddaddy will." Robert discovered that his whole family was really the Clements and not his, and he had to figure out how to reclaim his status in the household. He and Alice began fighting over her cooking, which had become a symbol of their class differences and the variation in Southern culture, depending on which state you happened to be from. Robert wanted oxtails and turnip greens and red-peppered gumbo like he grew up with in Louisiana. Alice had never really cooked for him before, and what she cooked was what any well-born 1950s homemaker would prepare for her family, the soufflés and casseroles of the upper classes of the day. She went to a great deal of trouble to make these Betty Crocker-era meals, but Robert didn't like them, and he took her style of cooking as a repudiation of his tastes. "It needs some more seasoning in it," he said. "The children don't like it that way," Alice told him. "Children eat what their mama give 'em," Robert said, "and you give 'em the food the way I like it to be cooked." But it was already too late. The children had become set in their expectations, the family system already established. Robert and Alice fought and fought over it. They were paying a price for the sacrifices they had made to get established outside the South. Every day they were confronted with a difference they hadn't noticed before, something so basic as a meal suddenly becoming a metaphor of the different worlds they came from. The dinner table became a testing of wills over which culture would prevail. The high-toned world of black elites in Atlanta, or the hard-scrabble but no less proud black middle class of small-town Louisiana, and more important, who was going to run the family? The Clements from afar, or Robert, who was working long hours to take care of them now? It exposed a chasm between the two of them that would never be fully resolved, but that both would have to live with. "That was a big hurdle," Robert said. As it was, they were living in a cramped apartment with temporary furniture and tacked-down rugs and trying to make the best of it. "We were not defined by where we lived," Robert said. "We felt we'd make it in time, and we lived that way." So long as they were in a walk-up apartment, Alice put off her socialite yearnings. She wanted to wait to make her presence known to the colored elite in Los Angeles. She wanted to wait until they could secure a house more befitting her station. She took a position teaching third grade in the Los Angeles public school system to help them save up for the house they would need before she could announce herself to L.A. society. Robert didn't see the point of waiting. She was the same person now as she would be when they got a house. But Alice knew the value of a proper entrance when one was coming in as an outsider, as any Southerner new to California would be. Robert kept asking anyway. It would be good for business to start making connections, and she was all but assured of acceptance to those patrician circles by birth alone. "Well, when you going to join?" he'd ask her. "It's too expensive for us out here now," she'd say. "The time's not right." From Atlanta, her mother had signed her up with the Lynx, perhaps the most elite of the invitation-only, class- and color-conscious colored women's societies of the era. But Alice wouldn't activate her membership until they got a house. "We're not ready, Robert," she said. "No, we're not ready." It was a reminder to Robert that he had not yet lived up to her and her family's expectations. The shadow of Rufus Clement loomed over him from across the continent. The family he was just now getting to know was used to living on an estate with formal gardens and servants, and here they were, cramped together with him in a walk-up apartment like wait staff. Robert was not in a position to duplicate what they had back in Atlanta, so he set out to prove himself in other ways. If Alice wasn't ready to go Hollywood, Robert was. His practice was just beginning to take off, and he had an idea of what he needed to cap off the image he was trying to create. He went to Dr. Beck for advice. "Doctor, I want to buy a Cadillac," Robert said, announcing his desire for the most coveted car on the market in those days. "Do you think I'd hurt myself if I bought a Cadillac?" "Can you meet the notes, boy?" "Yes, I can." "Go buy it, then." Alice was against it and said so. "How'd you like a Cadillac parked in front of an upstairs apartment? Don't you think you're a little premature?" "Yes, but I want one." "You don't want to buy a Cadillac and you live in a walk-up apartment," Alice said. "You don't have a garage to put it in." But Robert had made up his mind. He thought he could attract more patients with it. Patients half expected their doctor to be driving a Cadillac. It would make them respect him more, give them something to brag about. And if they were bragging about him, more patients might come his way. Besides, there was something deep inside him that had to prove to the world and to himself that he had made it. So he went downtown to Thomas Cadillac to buy himself one. But the sales clerk took him past the showroom of new Cadillacs to the dealership's used car lot. I told him I wanted a new car, and he kept showing me used cars, Robert said, exasperated but by now picking up on the subtleties of his interactions in the new world. I thanked him and went home, Robert said. Then he wrote a letter to General Motors, Cadillac Division, in Detroit. I'm a young black physician just getting started, he wrote. All my life I dreamed Cadillac, and when I had enough money to go down and get one, the man insults me by showing me used cars. Soon after he wrote the letter, he got a call from the dealership. We have instructions, Robert remembered the man saying, to deliver to you a Cadillac to your liking. What day would you like to come down and select it? It was 1955, so he headed right over to pick out a 1955 model. A white Cadillac, he said years later, a smile forming on his face, with blue interior and white wall tires. Yes, indeedy. See what you can get when you step on the right feet. Some of the people from Monroe thought the car pretentious and over the top. They were still having a hard time even picturing him a doctor. But just putting the key in the ignition made him feel like he had moved up in the world. And I learned that lesson from Dr. Beck's advice, Robert said years later. To hell with what people think of me. Go on and do what you want to do. They gonna do what they want to do anyhow. Say what they want to say anyway. He mulled over his words. That's right, he said. And you get more if they feel you ain't suffering. He was already plotting new ways to prove himself to the naysayers, black and white, in Louisiana and in L.A. My lifestyle'll blow 'em out of the water, Robert would say. Just blow 'em out of the water, 'cause I'll go on and do what I want to do.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial, 760-569-7676. And the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. The number one more time, 760-569-7676. And the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. Do not wait until the last minute. If you think you have something you want to share, something you want to comment on, we should have about 35 minutes, give or take, before the conclusion of the broadcast. I will keep an eye, see if folks have hands up or what have you. So we should have Mr. Demery for. Line should be open. If you have anything you want to share, anybody else, press star 6 if you would like to participate. Mr. Demery Ford, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Shouldn't do that. Yes, I have to find a quiet spot. I'll be back.
No worries. In the meantime, the Cadillac ending I thought was apropos. I think the symbolism of that particular brand of vehicle is ubiquitous. Through the years, I think many black people, that has been the status symbol, not just a Cadillac, in this case, a white Cadillac with white wall tires. That is, and I keep going back to the same song, CeeLo, Goody Mob. I think the song is The Nigger Experience. All for another nigger to see. The clothes, the car, all of that just to brag. I think Kanye West also has a song. It's like you get all this stuff just so you can look at other black people and say, oh, you don't have this nigger. You don't have a car like this nigger. You don't have clothes like this nigger. Consistent under racism, white supremacy. Let's see. I'm looking at some of the other things that stood out to me in that segment. Let's see. A few other notes that I took from that segment. Oh, the do's and don'ts. This was kind of the early portion of the second audio segment. This is from the Chicago Defender, where they had, this is a black newspaper, where they had, I guess, things that they were printing for the new arrivals to acculturate them to what it was like to live in the North and the differences. And so they print this list of do's and don'ts. Don't hang out the windows. Don't sit around in the yard and on the porch barefoot and unkempt. Don't wear handkerchiefs on your head. Use vile language in public places. Don't allow children to beg on the streets. Don't appear on the street with old dust caps, dirty aprons, and ragged clothes. Don't throw garbage in the backyard or alley or keep dirty front yards. Now, when I heard the list, I mean, some of this stuff, Dr. Welsing, she says consistently, black people, we should all have a PhD in sweeping, not throwing down trash in black areas. I think she says, that's another one I think she says almost every time she comes on the program, a part of black self-respect. Some of that I definitely can see, but I felt like some of this other stuff was just kind of, it's almost the same kind of talking down to black people that Asa Laveau, when he was on the program, Why I Won't Hire Black People. This sort of talking down and black people, this is why you can't get a job. You got your pants hanging off your behind and this sort of thing. Like, I don't know. I feel like it's a lot of black people, a lot of white people who use vile language in public and beg on the streets and throw down trash in different neighborhoods and what have you. Like, I don't know. It just, I don't know how I feel about that. Like, I can understand if they feel like they want to quote unquote help out the black people that are coming from the South who, might not know how you're supposed to behave or differences in customs with being a little bit further north. But it just had that same ring of even, when I hear people talking to black people, like, you need to stop eating fried chicken. That's what's wrong with you. You eat too much fried chicken and Kool-Aid and sitting around watching television and that sort of thing. Like, I think there was two different lists as well. They had the Urban League. They also had a list of do's and don'ts. Do not loaf. Get a job at once. Do not live in crowded rooms. Others can be obtained. Do not carry on loud conversations in streetcars and public places. Do not keep your children out of school. Do not send for your family until you get a job. It's just kind of interesting, I thought. These didn't have anything with regards to dealing with white people and what happens when they're charging you twice the rent for an apartment that they would a white person. What to do if a white terrorist mob breaks out and you are not at home, or if they come to your home. Doesn't have any do's and don'ts with regards to successfully dealing with a racist man, racist woman, racist child. But don't have your pants hanging off your behind. Don't have your handkerchief on your head when you go out the street. Like, I don't know. It just stuck out to me. We'll see if Mr. Demrevor, if you had anything you wanted to share, your line should be open.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, that was interesting what you were saying. I had a drop call, so I had to dial back in. I missed most of it, but, I think you were talking about the do's and don'ts that they were telling the migrants, what it was like in the North, and that was kind of funny, not wearing a head rag, that type of thing. But you know what? They did what they wanted to do anyway. But I thought about, you can take the person out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the person. So, but anyway, back to, let's see, was it? No, it was Pershing and Alice. They finally got, their apartment and all of this, and come to find out that they didn't even know each other, and she didn't. Well, I think that he was probably infatuated with her to begin with, because now when they get together, he wants gumbo and this soul food type stuff, and she's used to a different type of upbringing and a different type of cuisine. And I don't know if we know that he didn't ask that 200 questions that Mr. Fuller said you need to ask before you get with somebody. But they're starting to realize that there are two different people. And she did give him some good advice about the Cadillac, because that's, well, then again, I don't know, because he's a doctor and he has to, it's kind of like if you're a real estate agent, you may not have a lot of money, but if you're going to be showing $300,000 and up to maybe $1.5 million homes, you need to look the part. You don't need to come up in a jalopy when you try to show some expensive home. So if he wanted some respect and wanted a clientele, and he wanted the better things in life, he had to aspire to that type of lifestyle. So if you think about that, it wasn't that bad. But I don't want to forget about Ida Mae. Ida Mae is, I think the book refers to where they were living was just a little bit better than slave cabins. They were on top of each other. There wasn't enough room. They couldn't even get their suitcases in there. And you think about when you're young and you're starting out and you don't have a lot of money, the hardships you go through. But, I don't think any of us ever experienced anything like that. One thing I do want to mention is that if the Great Migration happened between 1915 and it went all the way through 1975, that means that I was in the Great Migration, because I left the South in 1972. And although I visited L.A., I actually met some Black Panthers, but I ended up settling in Chicago. So a lot of things that they're discussing about Chicago, I know it somewhat, but I was there in the 70s and things were a little better, but I didn't know a whole lot when I got there, and there was nobody there to bring me up to speed with any do's or don'ts. I had to learn it the hard way. But the characters, I like the way that the book is written. She's moving the characters along. We're getting to know their personalities and what they are, what their goals are, and what their mannerisms and characteristics are. And I like that. And they're all becoming human. And it almost seems as though you know it. And I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate being involved in this book study. And I'm looking forward to the continual development of the characters. I have to admit, I went ahead. And so I'm almost at the end. But I promise not to divulge any information. So I'll give someone else a chance. Thanks for taking my call.
Right on. Yeah, the book is very well written, very well researched as well. That should not be slept on. I think she said she took 15 years to put this project together. She said she stopped counting. That's what she said. She didn't say she did 1,200 interviews. She said she stopped counting at approximately 1,200. So it's thoroughly researched. I have great regard for people who sit down, take the time to be comprehensive, detailed, and collecting information as she did for this project. It's well put together. All of the accolades and prizes and everything that she's got for it, very well earned. Again, if you have a hard copy of the book, or even if you have the ebook or what have you, go to the bibliography section so that you can see where she's getting a lot of this information from. I strongly suspect there will be other books that you will want to check out. As I said, The Negro in Chicago, the text that she referenced with regards to the rioting that took place in Chicago. You can download that whole report, or you can read it online if you don't want to download it, but you can download the whole report for free online. Check it out. That also has some interesting tidbits if you want to dig further from what we've heard. There was a section, let's see, this was kind of at the beginning of the second audio segment from this week. Again, our program from yesterday. They say, one day a white friend went up to a longtime Oakland resident named Eleanor Watkins to ask her what she thought about all the newcomers. Eleanor, the woman said, "You colored people must be very disgusted with some of the people who have come here from the South and the way they act." "Well, Mrs. S," Eleanor Watkins replied, "yes, some colored people are very disgusted, but as far as I'm concerned, the first thing I give them credit for is getting out of the situation they were in. Maybe they don't know how to dress or comb their hair or anything, but their children will, and their children will." I thought that was a great way to turn that response from this white person. As you were saying earlier, I think the previous audio segment, how white people, as always, are to blame in instigating this conflict between the black people who were the first wave of the migrants, or maybe they were already in that area, and the newcomers. So that there's a disdain, and oh, look at them, and they're dressed. Look at how they're dressed, and look at how they're behaving, and they got their handkerchiefs on, and they're not wearing any shoes. They got their children out begging in the streets, and just to have that contempt, that anti-blackness, and to get you to join in on it as though you are special. I think even Dr. Welsing talks about that, where they will say, "Well, oh, you're not like those other niggers. You know, don't you think that these niggas over here, don't you agree with me and thinking that there's something defective and wrong with these black people?" I think it's really easy. The system of white supremacy, it sets up an environment, a way of thinking, the way we use words, so that it's very easy to just begin talking bad about, looking down on another black person, and her bringing it back to context. The horrible situation that these people were leaving under the system of white supremacy and being terrorized by whites, and why they had to come to that wherever they went to, if they were going to California or New York or wherever else, why they were fleeing in the first place, being victims of racism, and not having resources. Not like they were living it up when they were down south and getting lots of money. I mean, living slavery by another name, Douglas Blackman. Not like they were coming out of the best situation anyway. Just another reason or another opportunity for white people to look down upon black people. I thought that was worth. And this is a quote-unquote white friend who was saying all this. And also I took note that they did not name whoever this person happened to be. I think this is from, I'm checking the footnotes. Apparently this came from Pioneer Urbanites, a social and cultural history of San Francisco by Douglas Henry Daniels. I don't know if this is a white person, non-white person who authored this report, but I think this even goes back to what we were talking about last week, the point that Mr. Demery Ford made about how white people have studied us intensely. They don't have any secrets. I think that's come out this week as well, where they got this massive 700-page volume studying black people in Chicago. This report in the California area, they are not ignorant. They're not poorly informed. They, are not lacking knowledge about their subjects. They make that an integral aspect of their business to make sure that they are well informed, well versed about what their subjects have been up to, short term and long term. I think that's another point that cannot be understated with this text. Let's see. Yeah, about 10 minutes or so left in the broadcast. Anything else stood out in the passage, Mr. Demery Ford, that you wanted to share?
Yes, give me a few minutes. I'll be back.
No worries. Let's see. Checking out the rest of my notes, and I'm looking at the footnotes here. It's fascinating. That's something I try to make a habit to do, even sometimes before I begin a book, particularly at this point, because we've had so many authors on the program. Frequently, people that they will have in the footnotes will have been guests on our program at some point. So that's something I would encourage folks to do. Whatever book that you're reading, check the footnotes. Generally will have interesting information. If nothing more, you'll just get more details on how they put that particular book together. Let's see. And it looks, well, I have the ebook. If you have the ebook of The Warmth of Other Suns, it looks like some of these resources or references are linked so that you can just access the material online. And I always appreciate that, making it even easier if you want to check and find out where they got some of this information from. So check that out if you're near a good library. If they're news articles or magazines, things of that nature, if you are near a good university library, they'll have a lot of this material on site or online or both. So if you're in a major city, definitely you can take the book with you and just make a little library trip out of it. That's a great way, I think, if you have children, particularly if they're older, around high school, to get them into researching and being comfortable using the library and finding materials. You can just take a book like this, or if they have another book that they're interested in, and it has, sources like this, where it's got a newspaper clipping from like the New York Times 1920 or Chicago Tribune 1930. You can make it a little field trip. Go to the library and let's see if we can find all these sources, and then go check it out and see what they had to say. That's something I try to do on a regular basis. You can learn a lot and get more details that way.
Okay, I'm back. Can I be heard, Gus?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes, I wanted to mention also that the part when they said Robert Pershing, Foster, a lot of black people did not immediately seek him out for his services, and he said he thought that they may be going to white people, and then he said, I don't know where they're going, but they're not coming to me. And I was just thinking, it may not be going anyplace, because I have known people, well, Ida Mae for one, she had never been in a hospital before. And, she had her babies through the midwife. And a lot of black people don't go to doctors, for regular checkups. They end up going for a checkup, and then they get the diagnosis that you got 6 months to live, because they never went for an annual exam. A lot of that happened among the black community. I always talk about medical disparities, but it's strange to me that black people get particular diseases like diabetes. Sooner or later you go get diagnosed with high blood pressure. I find that, it has to be some type of connection, with the experiences that we have, and the way that the system is exerting itself upon us. And then you got the pharmaceutical companies that are just dispensing medications on a regular basis, and a lot of this medication doesn't help. And even if it did, all it does is relieve symptoms. It never cures anything. And a lot of black people were used to going to holistic practitioners, root doctors, and people of that sort, where they would have a lot of different medicines that were organic in nature. So the point I was making is that they may not have been going any place, and as a collective, we're not known for visiting the doctor on a regular basis. I think that Dr. Cushing his character is developing. At first it looked like he was self-centered, and he was only thinking about himself, but he's starting to, get a personality that is complete, because I think he really genuinely cares about people. He was concerned about the people from Monroe, but they wasn't necessarily thinking about his. He did have some buddies that was helping him out. When he was setting up his office, someone came by, helped him with furniture. They made sure that he ate and this and that. So, it's turning into, this would make an excellent movie. Although it will probably be too expensive to produce. But I can really visualize this, and I'm enjoying it. Thanks.
A la Roots almost. Make a little TV miniseries out of it. Do it in sections, seeing how all the characters progress through the years. Although I do think it would be kind of depressing. I don't know how this is going to end, but yeah, I feel like we've read more than half. I guess we're about 60% of the way through the book, maybe a little further along than that. But like it would be not one of those where you get to the end feeling great and wonderful. I could be wrong. Well, I'll keep that in mind as we progress to the conclusion. But it definitely would not be one of those where you walk out feeling good about things. I don't think. But yeah, like I said, I am enjoying it. It is a lot of great information, and kind of, again, feels like she could be talking about characters and people in 2013, which is something she wanted, that it was a purposeful, a deliberate aspect in how she wrote the book. According to her own testimony, she wanted people to feel like she was, what would you do in this situation? Or that she could be talking about people that you know, current day. And I definitely have had that feeling throughout the book. I did check the footnotes where she got that section about this quote-unquote white friend talking to Miss Eleanor Watkins. This is from Pioneer Urbanites, I said, A Social and Cultural History of Black San Francisco, and some of this is online as well. Just to add, this is the more context to where she got this quote from. Mrs. Watkins, who's a black female, says that she was very sensitive to the criticism blacks and some whites made about the migrants. She saw them in terms of their background, their struggles, and their attempts to improve the lives of their children. These efforts overshadowed what others saw as backwardness. A friend came up to her and once remarked, and this is the passage that I already read, and she says, like Mrs. Watkins, the descendants of the black pioneers came to see their similarities with the newcomers while remaining aware of some differences. Old-timers knew one another and had contact with whites that often dated from childhood. Pre-war migrants were consequently often less suspicious of whites and somewhat less critical of discrimination than the newcomers. That is profound, if accurate. Work cooperation in various organizations, the marriage of their children to one another, and other opportunities for association brought these two streams in Afro-America, old and new urbanites, more closely together. Besides adding a more complex dimension to the metropolitan existence of blacks in the Bay Area, the sudden influx in mid-century made the history of the pioneer blacks more remote, but not inaccessible. Again, this is Pioneer Urbanites, A Social and Cultural History of Black San Francisco. That in and of itself is fascinating, even pondering on that some of these black people, although I guess it's not that surprising if you think about it, black people who migrated first and had more contact with white people, maybe grew up and had quote-unquote white friends, being less critical, less informed about racism, white supremacy. That makes it, and especially on the West Coast, I can say that having lived in the Bay Area and being on the West Coast, that I said that all the time. If I had grown up out here, I would have had white friends. I would probably still have white friends. I would have a lot more white people that I'd been in contact with. I definitely don't think I would be doing this radio program. I too would be less critical of quote unquote discrimination, white supremacy, racism. So it makes sense what they're saying. I guess I just hadn't thought about it in terms of this having been the case for a long, long time, even going all the way back 40s and 50s and what have you. Right on. I will assume, unless you have a last thought you want to get in, Mr. Demery, anything before we wrap things up?
No, I think I covered everything. Can I be heard?
Oh, yes, sir. We can hear you.
Okay.
Outstanding.
I think I covered everything.
Right on. I also wanted to make sure I did not forget, as I said at the beginning, I think we were going to be seeing more and more of James Crow, the more refined aspect of white supremacy, racism, the portion where it talks about Dr. Robert Pershing Foster, where he had this apartment all set up. He's waiting for Alice and his offspring to move out to California with him, and he thinks he's already got a residence set up for them to stay, and then bang, it says when it actually came time to move in, the manager, I suspect a racist, told him she, white racist, white female racist, was sorry, but it was already rented to somebody else. That was my introduction to the deception of California, he said. I thought that was important too. Do not think just because you are above the Mason Dixon Line or you migrate to a different part of the planet that racism, white supremacy will not be a problem for you. Right on. We'll be back tomorrow for the compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Dr. Niyana Rasayan should be with us this Sunday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. looking forward to hearing from him, getting more details, information on the shooting that took place in Washington, D.C. just a few days ago. Isabel Wilkerson, that's her neck of the woods. She grew up in the D.C. area. But that'll be this Sunday evening. Folks can tune in for that. We'll have our 10th installment on the Warmth of Other Suns next Friday. Tune in. Be good to hear input from listeners. I know some people did have some issues with the free HD line. If that continues to be a problem, folks can just let me know. We'll see if we can have some other alternatives for folks to be able to participate and tune in to the program live if you want to participate. I do want to make sure we encourage listeners to chime in. This was the book that you all voted on to do, so hopefully more people will chime in, share their thoughts, things that stick out during the remainder of the book study session. That's what this is supposed to be about, us exchanging views, sharing thoughts on the text. Thanks all for tuning in. We'll upload the audio for the program promptly, and we'll see everyone tomorrow. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Thanks all for tuning in. I hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. Creator, it has been time. Give us the will, the ability, the patience, the perseverance to replace the system of white supremacy racism with justice as soon as possible. It has been time. Thanks all for tuning in. Context of White Supremacy, signing out.
I'm a victim, brother.
You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Even my conditioning has been conditioned.